welcome to today's lesson on mindfulness. So mindfulness is a key part of this journey because it really helps you to observe yourself and really do this in an objective way and help you identify the parts of you or the behaviors that you have that you really want to change. So what we're going to be learning in this lesson is, first of all, what actually is mindfulness? Where is it useful? And then how can you start practicing this and getting really in a space where it becomes an automatic for you?
And so when we talk about mindfulness, what we really mean is mindfulness is a practice of observing our thoughts, actions, and behavior in the real moment, and it allows us to shift from a position of engagement to observation. Now, I want you to think about some patterns that you have in your life. I know there's plenty in ours that we have that are automatic engagements. For instance, maybe you have a stressful thought and you latch onto that stressful thought and you allow it to pull you everywhere. Lindsay calls it the stressful thought bus because you're just jumping on at the stop and it's taking you wherever it wants to go. Whereas when we become mindful, it's a practice of observing the thought, observing the action, observing what we're experiencing. And the great thing about shifting to observation is it allows us the space to actually change the behavior, because the only way to change a behavior is to become aware of what you're doing. It's like, have you ever had something that you've done consistently and you're like, oh, I didn't realize I was actually doing that until you became aware. And so mindfulness is an amazing practice for becoming self-aware. And the reason why it's important for this lesson is because we've talked about habits, we've talked about building a vision, and we're focusing on this new lifestyle. And to expect that you can just change it on a whim is not realistic, and that's not how it works. But if we become self-aware and when we have a practice that guides us towards where we want to be, we can shift from that engagement mode and we can observe ourselves without guilt or judgment, and that allows us to take that next step forward. And that's how we really craft momentum in our lifestyle, and it's what really allows us to always make sure that we're getting back on the right path. It doesn't necessarily keep us on the right path because there's going to be challenges along the way, but it allows you to say, okay, I have this pattern, this behavior that I've done for years. Oh, I'm aware of how it is. And then when it comes up again, you now have a thought process and an action that allows you to snap back into the moment and move yourself forward.
And so we do need to be strategic about how we develop mindfulness. So we do have a few key practices that will help you develop this mindfulness because, again, mindfulness is like a muscle. It's something that you have to strengthen. And so there are a few ways that you can really do this for yourself consistently. And so the first one is, like Brian mentioned, it's shifting from that pretty common mode of engagement into observation. And the way that we do this is by developing what we call a pause. And so a pause is what happens the moment before you take the action, the moment before you eat the extra cookie, the moment before you decide to skip the gym. It's the moment before the decision takes place. And typically we don't even think about that because it's so automatic. But when you actually develop a pause, you can make a decision that you actually want to make. So for example, say you're at work or at home and you receive a stressful email, and even the thought of responding to it makes you so upset. So you're like, oh, well, I'm really hungry right now anyway, so I'm gonna go to the kitchen or the break room or wherever, and I'm gonna grab a snack. And the pause comes into play where you get to the kitchen, you get to the break room, and you're like, wait, am I even hungry? Or am I just stressed right now? Why am I actually going for food? And that's why a pause is so powerful to start utilizing. And so with that said, that is the first step of what you want to start working on this week. So the next step that you want to utilize.
Once we have the pause, we want to shift from engagement to curiosity. And that also might be shifting from judgment to curiosity. Now, I want you to think of a certain pattern or behavior where you need to implement a pause. Maybe you can stop for a second and write that one down. So what is that pattern or thought that you typically engage in where you need a pause? All right, now that you're back, what we want you to think about is what it would feel like to engage in a curious thought on that action. So maybe it's a stressful eating pattern, or maybe it's boredom eating, or maybe you're like me, like I have had in the past a little bit of a temper. And it's taken me a lot to work through some of the patterns and beliefs that were holding me back from actually engaging in the habits and the behavior that I actually wanted rather than what I did in the past. And so for me, I'd have to pause and ask myself, instead of like, oh, why am I doing this again, and feeling guilty or judged, I can ask myself and observe it like, hey, like, what are you actually upset about? What's actually bothering you in this moment? What are you holding on to in this moment that's holding you back from actually moving forward? And the cool thing about becoming curious is that it's a pattern that can happen just like that. Like Lindsay said, if you're eating the cookie in the break room, or you're having that snack and you're not actually hungry, you can stop and say, do I actually need to finish this? Am I actually hungry right now? What am I aiming to get out of this? And so once we become curious and we really become aware in that moment, we can then remove the guilt or the judgment. Now, when we talk about changing our eating habits, that's something that a lot of us have guilt or judgment around, because either we've tried in the past and we failed, we have a story about why we're not going to be successful in this journey, we have a belief that's in really a place of misunderstanding that we have to eat certain foods in order to lose weight or to see results. And for instance, if you're someone who has a pattern like that, where you find yourself falling back is when you might have had a food that you didn't plan on having. So you stopped at the restaurant, they didn't have the ideal food, and you had to eat something else, and you're like, oh, I just screwed up everything. And that creates all this guilt because you're playing into a story that's not true. Whereas when we become curious, when that thing starts to come off, we can start to say, okay, well, what did I actually eat? How much of it did I eat? And then we can remove the judgment of understanding like how much we're putting into our body. So for instance, if you're someone who eats a 250 calorie cookie, you're trying to lose weight. If you're trying to lose weight, you should probably still be eating about 1,500 to 2,000 calories, generically speaking. And now, if you look at that cookie, that's only 250 calories out of that day. It's not ruining your progress. And so when you remove the judgment, you can actually see things as what they are. And the powerful part about that is you won't make things worse. Because it's easy to allow one bad habit or one bad behavior or one slip up that we make because we're not perfect roll over into other things. It's like, oh, I had a cookie today, so I guess I'm going to eat the ice cream later, and I've already screwed up today, so I got to wait until tomorrow, and then tomorrow turns into waiting until Monday, and then everything has this snowball effect. But if we stop, take a deep breath, pause, and move to a position of curiosity, we can start to align on the behavior that we actually want to build off of, and that's something that gives us momentum in this journey.
Exactly. And so once you have developed that pause and you're really working on shifting to curiosity, the next step, as you may guess, is just to practice. Practice these things in real time, but also practice them before the real time. Because if you develop this practice of mindfulness outside of real time, it makes making those decisions, pausing, being curious, it makes it easier. So there's two parts to this. You can really focus on the practices, and then you also need to reflect on those practices, because you might have a day where you do end up eating the extra brownie, or you do end up sleeping in from your day before and you miss a workout, whatever it is. But instead of judging yourself and being like, like Brian said, getting upset with yourself, you have to reflect and say like, hey, okay, maybe that wasn't the best choice, but next time I can be more mindful of that. So the two practices that we want to give you and encourage you to utilize this week are meditation and journaling. So meditation is typically thought of as this extensive practice of clearing all of the thoughts and oming until you reach Zen. But that's not what meditation needs to be. And oftentimes it's not that. It's really just a practice of sitting back, getting relaxed, and observing what goes on in your head, observing all of the thoughts that you have. And just, as I said to Brian earlier, it's like sitting at the bus stop and just watching the thoughts go by. That's an illustration that I use for myself all the time when I'm meditating. It's so helpful to just be like, oh, I'm a bystander of my thoughts, but they can still be there. They can still be present. It's just you're watching them go by and not grabbing onto them, jumping on the bus and riding down the street with them. So that's meditation. And then as far as journaling goes, that's the process of putting all of your thoughts on paper. It doesn't have to be something where there's 10 prompts for you to write an answer to. That's typically where I get questions about journaling is, well, what should I write about, and what questions do I need to answer, and what do I need to ask myself? And it's really often just dumping out all the thoughts so that you can see them objectively. And so you aren't judging them. You're just like, oh, okay, well, that's why I'm stressed, instead of being like, God, I hate myself for being so stressed. So Those are the two practices. So what do we want them to work on?
And so this week's focus is to, first off, try to meditate. Now, we don't want to put the pressure on you to try this. We don't want you to be in a position where you feel like you have to meditate for hours on end or build a negative connotation with it. So what we want you to do instead is just set aside 2 times where you're going to meditate and pick 1 to 3 minutes. Just 1 to 3 minutes to meditate. All we want you to do is put on some calming music. Some meditation music is typically what I do. And just focus on your breath. Close your eyes, breathe in, breathe out, and become centered in that moment with yourself. Just observing your thoughts, observing how you're feeling, and maybe it's even setting intentions, like putting it into your morning routine and setting your intentions for how you want your day. Putting it into the time before you get to work while you're in your car and setting the intentions for how you want to work. Or maybe it's after you got to work and you're heading home. Whatever it is, we encourage you to meditate because it's something that will give you an anchor towards how you want to show up throughout this process. And from my standpoint, meditation has been the one thing that's fundamentally changed my life. It's allowed me to look at my behavior, my actions, and my thoughts in a way that is helpful for understanding myself. And when you gain that leverage over yourself, you can actually start to shift a lot of these behaviors in real time as they come up throughout your day or throughout your life.
Yeah, and if at this moment in your journey, meditation is not going to work for you, like if it's too challenging or it's not helping you, that's okay. It's really okay. You can always come back to it in another week and another time. But if that isn't working for you, then what we want you to do is journal. So you can journal, like I said, you can journal your intentions, or what Brian said. You can journal in the morning or before you go to bed. You can even just take note of how you're feeling throughout the day. You can use I use a notes app on my phone sometimes. And if I'm like noticing a pattern or something about myself that's either positive or I just want to change it, then I'll put the note in my phone so that I can kind of be mindful of that behavior. So that's still journaling, even if it's in a notes app on your phone. So that's really what we want you to focus on this week. Either meditate for 1 to 3 minutes or journal your thoughts in the morning, throughout the day, whenever, and just embrace the process of it because this is a practice. So enjoy this week and we will see you next week.
Cheers.
Bye, guys.